About 2 months ago, I made a video taking a look at a video made by Vox, which was talking about mass shootings, gun-related violence, and suicide. Today I want to take a look at the opposite side of the argument, which largely revolves around self-defense. To do that, I'm going to be using this infographic as a guide, as well as some of my own research. But before we get started on that, I want to briefly summarize some of my points from the previous video regarding gun violence. First, the US ranks number 12 when compared to European countries for mass shooting frequency, and 11th for mass shooting fatalities. This is despite the fact that the US has the highest guns per capita rate in the world, and only looking at rankings which include the US and European countries. Next, Vox said that 92 people are killed per day on average with guns, about 30 of which are homicides, 1.5 of those are mass shootings, and 58 are suicides. I looked at the CDC figures for this and verified that this was actually accurate. Vox, as well as many gun control advocates, like to treat suicide as though it could be prevented by gun control. But a look at the very graph that Vox provides to show this, as well as CDC statistics, seems to indicate that gun ownership doesn't increase suicide rates, being that people in the US are as likely to kill themselves by other means as they are by guns. And if it were the case that guns lead to higher death rates, the assumption would be that in all those countries with lower rates of gun ownership, their suicide rates would far exceed the US had they equal guns per capita. Also, the US appears as number 50 on suicide rates for the whole world, being exceeded by a number of countries which also appear in the Human Development Index's top 30 countries in the world, despite them having significantly fewer guns. Here are two graphs showing homicide rates by year in the US. One showing only people ages 10 to 24, whom it disproportionately affects. The other shows the homicide rates by race. In both graphs, we can see a steep decline in homicide rates over the years, particularly following the Brady Act of 1993, which required criminal background checks for firearm purchases. However, a look at the homicide rates in the UK shows a steep increase in homicide rates after 1997, following a ban on handguns and all non-sporting firearms, such as long guns, rifles, and shotguns. The homicide rates see a downturn in 2002 and 2003, for whatever reason. As a note, I'm not implying the handgun ban caused the increase in homicide rates, only noting the correlation. In Australia, on the other hand, following the 1996 gun ban and government buyback program, we see only a very slight change in homicide rates. The Vox video then went on to show the rates of burglary and assault in the top 10 countries for human development, showing that the US is lower for both crimes, trying to equivocate burglary and assault rates to crime rates, in order to show that even though the US is lower in these two specific crimes, they are higher in homicide rates. What they failed to mention is that burglary isn't a high cause of homicides in the US, because most burglars tend to commit the crime when nobody is home, out of fear that the homeowner may own a gun. The highest cause of homicides in the US, according to the FBI, was robbery. You know, that crime where someone pulls a gun or knife on you and demands you give them all your money. Rather than look at only two very specific crimes, I decided to look at the overall crime rate in these 10 highly developed countries, and found that the US had the highest crime rate, which correlates with the highest homicide rate. An argument can be made for the US having higher crime rates because of higher gun ownership, but studies indicate that single-parent households, usually absent of positive male role models, physical abuse by a parent, poverty, and lower than high school education, are major contributors to crime. It also doesn't make much sense to say that guns cause higher crime rates when you consider that urban areas experience higher crime rates, despite the fact that rural areas have higher gun ownership rates. Finally, 1/3 of Americans owns a gun. That means roughly 106,300,000 Americans owns a gun. And if we calculate what percentage of gun owners are responsible for the 8,454 gun homicides in 2013, we'd get 0.00799%. And that's being so generous as to assume that every gun homicide was committed by a legal gun owner, and every single homicide was committed by a different person who killed only one person. Alright, so that wasn't every point that I made in my previous video, but those are some major ones to sum it up. Now on to the self-defense statistics. So we'll start off with this part of the infographic, which shows the instances of self-defense compared with the combined instances of homicide, accidental death, and suicide. Each gun icon represents 31,672 instances, meaning there were 31,672 instances of homicide, accident, and suicide each year, by comparison to the roughly 80.5 gun icons to represent self-defense, meaning 2,549,596 instances of self-defense per year. So this comes from the CDC report, which puts total firearm deaths at 33,636. You might notice the 48,545 poisoning deaths, which exceeds firearm deaths. 38,851 of those are unintentional poisoning deaths, and 6,637 of those are poisoning suicides, leaving 3,057 poisoning homicides, which for some reason they don't include in their homicide numbers. There are 11,208 firearm homicides. Sorry for getting a little sidetracked there, I just found those numbers interesting. Before I get into their source for figures on firearm self-defense, I want to look at some of my own sources I was looking at, starting with this CNS News article titled CDC Study Use of Firearms for Self-Defense is Important Crime Deterrent, which refers to a study published by the CDC and compiled by the Institute of Medicine and the National Research Council from previous studies, which coincidentally includes the very studies cited by the infographic. So it says, studies that directly assessed the effect of actual defensive uses of guns, i.e. incidents in which a gun was used by the crime victim in the sense of attacking or threatening an offender, have found consistently lower injury rates among gun-using crime victims compared with victims who use other self-protective strategies. The CDC's study entitled Priorities for Research to Reduce the Threat of Firearm-Related Violence states. The report, which notes that violent crimes, including homicide specifically, have declined in the past 5 years, also pointed out that some firearm violence results in death, but most does not. In fact, the CDC report said most incidents involving the discharge of firearms do not result in a fatality. In 2010, incidents in the U.S. involving firearms injured or killed more than 105,000 Americans, of which there were twice as many non-fatal firearm-related injuries, 73,505, than deaths. The next paragraph regards the self-defense figures in the CDC report, which we'll look at in a moment, so I'll skip to the next part. Most felons report obtaining the majority of their firearms from informal sources, adds the report, while stolen guns account for only a small percentage of guns used by convicted criminals. Researchers also found that the majority of firearm deaths are from suicide, not homicide. Between the years 2000 and 2010, firearm-related suicides significantly outnumbered homicides for all age groups, annually accounting for 61% of the more than 335,600 people who died from firearm-related violence in the United States. African American males are most affected by firearm-related violence, with 32 per 100,000 deaths. Risk factors and predictors of violence include income inequality, diminished economic opportunities, high levels of family disruption, and low levels of community participation. The report expresses uncertainty about gun control measures, stating that whether gun restrictions reduce firearm-related violence is an unresolved issue, and that there is no evidence that passage of right-to-carry laws decrease or increase violent crime. It also stated that proposed gun turn-in programs are ineffective. Instead, researchers proposed gun safety technologies such as external locking devices and biometric systems to reduce firearm-related deaths. This is from the introductory chapter of the CDC's report, Priorities for Research to Reduce the Threat of Firearm-Related Violence. Defensive use of guns by crime victims is a common occurrence. Although the exact number remains disputed, almost all national survey estimates indicate that defensive gun uses by victims are at least as common as offensive uses by criminals, with estimates of annual uses ranging from about 500,000 to more than 3 million. In the context of about 300,000 violent crimes involving firearms in 2008, on the other hand, some scholars point to a radically lower estimate of only 108,000 annual defensive uses based on the National Crime Victimization Survey. That'll be something we'll want to note when we look at the studies later. The variation in these numbers remains a controversy in the field. The estimate of 3 million defensive uses per year is based on an extrapolation from a small number of responses taken from more than 19 national surveys. The former estimate of 108,000 is difficult to interpret because respondents were not asked specifically about defensive gun use. A different issue is whether defensive uses of guns, however numerous or rare they may be, are effective in preventing injury to the gun-wielding crime victim. Studies that directly assessed the effect of actual defensive uses of guns, i.e. incidents in which a gun was used by the crime victim in the sense of attacking or threatening an offender, have found consistently lower injury rates among gun-using crime victims, compared with victims who used other self-protective strategies. Effectiveness of defensive tactics, however, is likely to vary across types of victims, types of offenders, and circumstances of the crime, so further research is needed to both explore these contingencies and to confirm or discount earlier findings. Even when defensive use of guns is effective in averting death or injury for the gun user in cases of crime, it is possible that keeping a gun in the home or carrying a gun in public, concealed or open carry, may have a different net effect on the rate of injury. For example, if gun ownership raises the risk of suicide, homicide, or the use of weapons by those who invade the home of gun owners, this could cancel or outweigh the beneficial effects of defensive gun use. Although some early studies were published that relate to this issue, they were not conclusive, and this is a sufficiently important question that it merits additional careful exploration. To sum up the several sections regarding risk factors for firearm-related violence, factors include income inequality, residential mobility, social isolation, unemployment, drug trafficking, diminished economic opportunities, high concentrations of impoverished residents, high levels of transiency, high levels of family disruption, low levels of community participation, and socially disorganized neighborhoods, impulsivity, low education, substance use, and prior history of aggression and abuse. Risk factors for suicide include living alone, substance use, depressive symptoms, unemployment, recent military active duty status, acute crises, and relationship problems. Studies have shown that weapon carrying among youth is closely related to having been victimized or having witnessed violence and high levels of aggression. There is also evidence that youth who carry guns may do so because they feel vulnerable to victimization, although other studies have found gun carrying to be a component of highly aggressive delinquency. The presence of or use of drugs or alcohol is associated with assaultive and firearm violence. Criminals often use violence to acquire money, goods, or other rewards. However, many instances of violence often are impulsive, angry responses to perceived or experienced social or physical threats. These acts of violence may also occur as a response to challenges to social status in the presence of an audience. There is also evidence that observing a gun can prime aggressive behavior in certain situations. Drinking to excess, drug use, recreational pursuit of fun, involvement in drug dealing or group drug use, gang membership, involvement in minor or violent offending, and other lifestyle factors increase the risk of victimization. All of these factors are things typically associated with high-density, impoverished urban areas, which contribute to the high crime rate in those areas, despite the fact that they have lower gun ownership rates than rural areas. Sorry, I got a little sidetracked there, but I found the risk factors associated with gun violence to be interesting. Here the study reiterates the NCVS, National Crime Victimization Survey, estimates of self-defensive gun use, which are 60,000 to 120,000, and mentions the estimates of Gary Kleck at 2.5 million. So the next bit is an excerpt from the infographic source, which also happens to be a source in the CDC study, a study by Gary Kleck and Marc Gertz, titled Armed Resistance to Crime, the Prevalence and Nature of Self-Defense with a Gun. Now, if you'll remember correctly, the CDC study said that the main source of criticism for the 500,000 to 3 million figure was the NCVS study, which placed annual figures around 108,000, whereas 19 separate independent studies were the sources for the 500,000 to 3 million figures. It's ironic to me that skeptics of these figures cite the NCVS study as evidence that these 19 other surveys are wrong, being that these 19 other surveys only exist because those people conducting them found the NCVS to be flawed. Here, Kleck points out that the NCVS study is inaccurate because it is an anonymous survey conducted by a branch of the federal government. Respondents are told in face-to-face interviews that the survey is being conducted on behalf of the U.S. Department of Justice. Reporting the use of a gun for self-defense is a sensitive matter because the act might constitute unlawful assault, or the respondents may have been unknowingly in violation of gun control laws, such as those which might restrict carrying the weapon outside of the home, in a public space, or in a vehicle. Most respondents aren't well acquainted with the complicated laws of self-defense or firearm regulation, and may choose to withhold information about their defensive gun uses. Furthermore, respondents aren't even asked if they've used a gun for self-defense. They are only asked if they did anything to protect themselves against victimization. For any information regarding defensive gun use to be given to the NCVS, it must be volunteered by the respondent. The NCVS wasn't designed to estimate defensive gun uses, it was designed to estimate national crime victimization levels. Okay, now on to the survey, but first I've got to talk about some really boring shit, which is the research methods. The survey was conducted via anonymous random digital telephone survey. They did not know the identities of the respondents. They interviewed adults living in the lower 48 states aged 18 and over. Respondents were asked both about their own personal defensive gun use, as well as those of other members of the household. Defensive uses that were related to occupation or against an animal were excluded, and respondents that were asked exactly what they did with their guns, and how the use of their gun was connected to a specific crime. The respondents were only asked about defensive gun uses in the past 5 years and the past year. Interviewers always asked to speak to the person involved in the defensive gun use. In 85% of cases, respondents were unwilling to speak on behalf of other members of the household regarding their defensive gun use. For a reported incident to be considered genuine, it had to meet the following qualifications. It had to involve defensive action against a human, not an animal, and not have been in connection with police, military, or security guard duties. The incidents involved actual contact with the person rather than investigation of suspicious circumstances. The respondents had to be able to state a specific crime which was being committed at the time of the incident. The gun had to actually be used in some way. At minimum, they had to at least refer to the gun verbally, for example by saying, "Get away, I've got a gun," or pointing it at an adversary. To minimize the possibility of overstating the frequency of defensive gun use, a senior author went through the interview sheets of every case of defensive gun use to determine whether the incident might not be genuine. Cases were considered questionable if it was not clear whether the respondent actually confronted an adversary he saw, the respondent was an officer, member of military or security guard, the interviewer did not properly record exactly what the respondent did with the firearm, the respondent did not state or the interviewer did not record a specific crime being committed, and 22 incidents were disqualified on this basis, and 213 were accepted. The total weighted sample size was 4,977. This figure is remarkably low to gain an accurate gauge of defensive gun use at a national level, so this survey should be used with caution. However, the researchers mentioned that these low figures were the result of some general distrust in the interviewees, with some hanging up before the interview could be completed, or the respondent becoming suspicious and asking questions like, "Who wants to know?" Other flaws might be that respondents might have been lying, but the researchers consider this unlikely because the respondents would have to have been imaginative enough to come up with answers to 19 separate questions, while maintaining narrative consistency both in the initial interview and in the follow-up callbacks to verify the authenticity of the claims. So on to something a little more interesting, the actual data. In Table 3, you can see the defensive gun uses per person and per household, separated into columns by all guns and handguns over the past year and past 5 years. The figures in the A row are estimates based on all reported defensive gun uses reported in the survey, and the B row are the estimates based only on the cases with no indication that the case might not be a genuine defensive gun use. So we've got to briefly take a look at their methodology again. Their estimates of prevalence, the percentage used row, were computed by dividing the weighted sample frequencies in the top 2 rows by the total sample size of 4,977. The estimated number of persons or households who experienced a defensive gun use, listed in the 3rd and 4th rows, was then computed by multiplying these prevalence figures by the appropriate U.S. population base, age 18 and over for person-based estimates, and the total number of households for household-based estimates. So this is how they arrived at their 2.1 to 2.5 million defensive gun uses per year estimate. We'll look at the row A estimates on all guns per person for convenience. The 66 defensive gun uses represented 1.326% of their total sample size of 4,977, which, when multiplied by the U.S. population, gave them their estimated defensive gun uses in the past year of 2,549,862. Though their 4,977 sample size is not small, their 66 or 56 defensive gun uses in the past year is, and it struck me as a bit of a stretch to extrapolate roughly 2.5 million defensive gun uses per year from that. However, the study argues that the estimate may seem remarkable in comparison to expectations based on conventional wisdom, but it is not implausibly large in comparison to the various gun-related phenomena. There are probably over 220 million guns in private hands in the U.S., implying that only about 1% of them are used for defensive purposes in any one year. Not an impossibly high fraction. In a December 1993 Gallup survey, 49% of U.S. households reported owning a gun, and 31% of adults reported personally owning one. These figures indicate that there are about 47.6 million households with a gun. with perhaps 93 million or 49% of the adult U.S. population living in households with guns, and about 59.1 million adults personally owning a gun. Again, it hardly seems implausible that 3%, 2.5 million out of 93 million, of the people with immediate access to a gun could have used one defensively in a given year. While their sample seems to be more or less representative of the population, with 25.5% of the 4,977 surveyed personally owning a gun and 37.9% of those surveyed reporting living in a gun-owning household, I still would like to see a study with a larger sample size, not because the sample size itself was too small, but because the defensive gun use respondents were. I'm no statistician, but I'd like to see a sample size 4 to 6 times larger that produces a result consistent with these, giving defensive gun use figures between 200 to 300. Though I do agree that their figures of 1 to 3% of people with immediate access to a gun using it defensively not being implausible. So back to the infographic. After reviewing their source, as well as the CDC, which compiled its 500,000 to 3 million figure from 19 separate studies, the infographic is using figures at the higher end of the scale. However, even if we were to go with a more conservative figure of 500,000, we'd still have 15.786 of these self-defense gun icons in contrast to the 1 homicide, suicide, and accidental death icon. And I find arguments for the 108,000 figure from the National Crime Victimization Survey as a counter to this to be absurd and invalid. I know I said I was going to look at the entire infographic, but I want to keep this short, and it's starting to get lengthy, so I'll unfortunately have to pick up looking at the rest of the points later.